Some days out west, a man's fate could be sealed, not by bullets or blood, but by a gavel slammed onto splintered wood. One fall afternoon in Millbrook County, under the weight of unpaid debt and old secrets, a 19-year-old girl stood trembling on an auction block, and a rancher with 1,000 silent acres raised his hand. Not to own her, but to change everything. But why would Silas Thornfield, a widowed rancher known for his solitude and pride, bid on a girl he'd never met? And more than that, who was Eva Morrison really? Because just days later, the deadliest outlaw gang in the territory came riding straight for them, rifles drawn. This isn't just a story about danger or dusty towns or six-shooters at high noon. This is about redemption, about promises made at a deathbed, and how sometimes the person you save turns out to be the one who saves you. To understand how it all began, we need to go back to that day in October when the hammer fell and a man placed a $50 bid that would cost him far more than Millbrook County, October 1874. The wind was dry and mean that morning, kicking up dust that stuck to sweat and sorrow alike. But nothing stung more than the sound of that gavel. Sold. One word, final as a coffin lid. Eva Morrison stood motionless on the platform, her eyes locked on the planks beneath her feet. 19 years old, and already marked by the kind of shame that clung to a name like rust on iron. Her father had died the month before, left her nothing but a stack of gambling debts and a reputation no good man would touch. Judge Cornelius Webb wiped his brow and called it justice, said the auction was legal, said her labor would help settle what her daddy owed. But everyone in that crowd knew it wasn't just labor being bought that day. Men had come not with contracts or farm tools, but with slick smiles liquor on their breath, and the quiet understanding that out here, a girl alone was easy property. 15, 25. The numbers climbed like smoke, and Eva felt herself vanish by degrees, dignity dissolving with every bid. But then a voice cut through the noise like a blade. Silas Thornfield stood tall at the edge of the crowd, a rancher, widower, a man who'd lost his wife to illness and buried his joy with her. Folks said he'd been hollow since more shadow than man. But that morning something in him stirred, and when he spoke the whole crowd fell silent. Even Eva looked up. There was something in his face, not hunger, not pity, but purpose. The kind of quiet resolve forged in grief and tempered by years alone with land and cattle. He didn't look at her like a prize, but like a promise. No one else bid after that. No one dared. The gavel slammed. The deal was done. But as the crowd dispersed, murmurs thick as flies, Eva's stomach twisted, because the real question wasn't what she had been bought for. It was what came next. She rode beside him in silence, dirt road, stretching toward a future she hadn't chosen. Silas didn't speak, didn't touch her, just kept his eyes ahead, rein steady in his calloused hands. He didn't seem cruel. But kindness, she'd learned, was just another mask men wore before taking what they wanted. The ranch came into view like a mirage, a wide porch cottonwood swaying the mountains, watching from afar. It was too peaceful, too solid, and that scared her more than any shack or cell. Because deep down, Eva knew this wasn't just about paying off a debt. It was about rewriting a name hers in a town that had already sentenced her. And she didn't know if that was a blessing or a new kind of prison. But what happened when she stepped off that wagon? What did Silas really want? And what secret was waiting just behind the smokehouse, one that would challenge everything Eva believed about monsters and mercy? In a town like Millbrook, a man either belonged or he didn't. And Silas Thornfield had always stood somewhere in between. He wasn't born here, didn't come from money. Didn't drink at the saloon or trade gossip at the mercantile. When his wife passed from consumption 3 winters back, he buried her with his own hands under a cottonwood tree and didn't speak a full sentence to another soul for nearly a year. People respected him, but no one knew him. So when he stepped forward at Eva Morrison's auction, while other men elbowed and leered, it wasn't just the $50 that stunned the crowd. It was who had said it. Silas didn't attend events. He didn't chase women. He didn't even come to church after Sarah died. The last time most of Millbrook had seen him, He'd been standing in the back pew during her funeral, looking like a man trying to disappear. There he was, hand raised, voice calm, bidding more than half the town made in a season. People whispered that maybe he'd gone mad, that years of grief had twisted him into something reckless. Some said he wanted a young wife to keep his bed warm, others that he was lonely enough to buy company. But Martha Caldwell, the town's unofficial eyes and ears, wasn't so sure. She'd seen men buy women before, knew the difference between lust and strategy. And the way Silas looked at Eva that morning, it was neither. It was like he recognized something in her, a piece of himself maybe. A wound no one else could see. Back at the ranch, he didn't speak much during the ride. But when he finally did, it wasn't what Eva expected. "You'll have the room upstairs," he said. "There's a lock on the inside." A lock on the inside. Eva stared at him, trying to make sense of it. Men like him, men with land and power, didn't offer women privacy. They didn't give them choices. But Silas did. And he didn't touch her, didn't demand thanks. Just tipped his hat and disappeared into the barn. That night she watched him from the window. He worked the corral in the moonlight, hands, steady, shoulders bent with the weight of 100 quiet griefs. A man who carried his sorrow like a second skin. He didn't belong in that crowd at the auction. He belonged here in the silence, in the soil, in the spaces where words failed. But intention didn't. And as Eva sat on a bed she hadn't expected to sleep alone in, she realized something strange. Maybe this wasn't a cage after all. Maybe it was a beginning. But it would take more than silence and locked doors to build trust. And the next morning, over something as simple as dried meat, Eva would learn that not all languages are spoken, and not all walls are built of wood. The wheels of Silas Thornfield's wagon creaked over dry earth as the sun dipped low, painting the prairie gold. Eva sat beside him, rigid as a plank of oak. She didn't know where he was taking her, only that the road seemed to stretch forever in both directions, as if they weren't headed toward a place at all, but away from everything that had broken behind her. The silence between them wasn't cruel. It wasn't even awkward. But it was thick. And for a girl who'd grown up filling the air with words to mask fear, that kind of silence felt unbearable. The wind kicked up trails of dust behind the wagon. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes yelped a lonely laughing sound. And every time the wagon jostled over a rut, Eva's body tensed. She didn't trust where they were going. She didn't trust him. And worst of all, she didn't trust the part of herself that wanted to. Back in town, a girl like her had no choices. She'd been bartered and sold like a cow at market, with Judge Webb banging his gavel like it was the voice of God. And now here she was, rattling through open country with a stranger who had paid a fortune to bring her into his life, and hadn't so much as touched her hand. It was the not knowing that was hardest. Was this kindness a mask? Would the mask slip after a few weeks? Or a few drinks? She'd seen it happen before. Girls promised safety only to find it came with invisible shackles, the kind that wrapped around your body, your name, your future. She kept glancing sideways, studying Silas. His hands were steady on the reins, his jaw clenched like a man who had things to say, but no use for saying them. In another life, maybe she would have found comfort in his silence, but tonight it just made the road feel longer. And then somewhere past a bend in the hills, she saw it, the ranch. Not a shack, not a crumbling cabin, but a 2-story home with windows glowing orange in the dusk like it was waiting for her. It didn't look like a trap. It looked like something terrifying in its own right, hope. Silas brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He didn't open her door, didn't order her out, just waited, looking up at the sky like he was giving her space to choose. After a moment she stepped down, not because she trusted him, but because the alternative was going back to a world that had already sold her once. Inside the house smelled of pine and smoke, furniture handmade, a woman's photograph on the mantel, her eyes gentle. Eva paused in front of it. Sarah, Silas said, almost too quiet to hear. "My wife. She always wanted a daughter." Eva felt her throat tighten. That night she didn't sleep much. But for the first time in weeks, she wasn't listening for footsteps outside her door. Just the wind across the prairie. But not every storm stays outside. And just 2 days later, thunder came not from the sky, but from hooves. The Brennan brothers had arrived, and they weren't looking for a friendly chat. The house creaked softly that night, as if it too were waking from a long sleep. Eva lay awake in the upstairs room, staring at the ceiling beams, the silence broken only by the wind tapping gently at the window pane. But she wasn't alone. Not truly. This house, strong and warm as it appeared, held ghosts, not the kind that rattled chains in the night, but quieter ones, lingering spirits of memories of promises never buried. Downstairs, Silas Thornfield sat by the hearth, staring into the fire. In his calloused hands he held a photograph, the same one Eva had paused in front of earlier. A woman with soft eyes and a tender smile. Sarah Thornfield, his late wife. She'd been gone nearly 3 years, but Silas still spoke to her some nights. Not aloud, not always, but in the way his fingers brushed the frame. In the way he poured 2 cups of coffee each morning, though one always went cold. And in the way he stared at the door like he expected her to walk through it and scold him for forgetting his hat. But Sarah had left him with more than grief. She'd left him a promise. He remembered that final day clear as a desert sunrise. Sarah, frail and fading, gripped his hand with what strength she had left and whispered through cracked lips, "Find a girl who has no one and give her something to believe in. Give her what the world never gave me, safety. Home, a father's love, even if you're not blood." At the time, Silas thought it was just the ramblings of a dying woman. Beautiful, impossible words. But when he saw Eva Morrison on that auction block surrounded by wolves dressed in Sunday hats, he'd heard Sarah's voice again like thunder in his chest. And so he'd raised his hand. Not to own, but to protect. Upstairs, Eva stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She didn't know the full truth yet. Only fragments. Only that this stranger had offered her a room with a lock on the inside, and hadn't once made her feel owned. It felt wrong. And beautiful, like wearing a dress that still had someone else's scent. The next morning, as sunlight spilled through the windows, Eva found Silas in the kitchen frying eggs. He didn't say much, just poured her coffee and slid a plate across the table. She wanted to ask. About his wife. About why he'd brought her here. But the words wouldn't come. So she simply said, "Thank you." And he nodded quietly. But peace, she would learn, doesn't linger long in this part of the world. Because just before noon, as she stepped outside to feed the chickens, she saw dust on the horizon. Riders, 4 of them, moving fast. And the way Silas's hand drifted toward the rifle beside the door told her this wasn't a visit from neighbors, because not all storms announce themselves with thunder. Some ride in quietly, with teeth rope and rifles slung across their backs. The riders came fast, kicking up dust like a summer storm on the open plains. But Silas knew before they even reached the yard that this wasn't some neighborly drop-in. These weren't ranch hands or weary travelers. They were lawmen, or at least that's what their badges claimed. Deputy Garrett Boone led the pack, a man who carried his authority like a loaded pistol, dangerous in the wrong hands, which his often were. He reined in his horse with a swagger, spurs jingling like warning bells as he stepped onto Silas's porch without knocking. Behind him trailed Jake Morrison, reeking of whiskey even before noon, and 2 more men Eva didn't recognize, rough, unshaven, with the kind of eyes that scanned a place for weakness, not welcome. Boone didn't tip his hat or offer pleasantries, just pointed a gloved finger at the girl standing in the doorway. "We've come for her." Silas stood tall in the frame of the door, the light from inside casting a long shadow over the porch. "She's not some stray dog you can round up," he said. "She's under my roof now." Boone's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ain't about ownership, Thornfield. This is about concern. Folks in town are saying things. A young girl bought at auction, a man your age living alone. Don't look right." Eva stiffened behind Silas, her hands clenched. She'd heard enough of those whispers to last a lifetime. But this wasn't about concern. This was about control. Millbrook County had always been a place where justice took the back seat to whiskey and reputation. Sheriff Marcus Wade, the only real law around, was out on circuit. That left Boone in charge, and Boone never met a bribe he didn't like. Jake Morrison stepped forward, licking his lips. Maybe the girl ought to come with us, just for questioning. We'll make sure she's safe. That word safe fell from his mouth like poison. Silas didn't raise his rifle. He didn't have to. His voice dropped like a weight. You take one step closer and you'll see just how unsafe things can get. The tension stretched long enough to snap. Boone narrowed his eyes, then leaned back, pretending to chuckle. You got nerve, Thornfield. But nerve won't save you. Not when the whole town thinks you're hiding something. He turned back to his horse, mounting slowly. You'll see. Law's got a way of creeping in through the cracks. And with that, the riders disappeared in a cloud of dust and threats. Inside the house, Eva's hands still shook. They'll be back, she said. Silas nodded grimly. Yeah. And next time, they'll come with more than words. He poured himself a drink, not out of habit, but preparation, because he knew what was coming. And not just from Boone. Because rumors had long arms, and when gold is involved, they don't stop at county lines. And sure enough, as the sun dipped behind the hills that night, a new name surfaced, whispered like a warning carried on wind and fire. The house was quiet that night. Too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't just settle, it warns. Eva stood at the window watching the cottonwoods sway beneath a moon hung low like a judgment. Silas was outside making the final checks around the ranch. And she was alone in the room he'd given her, safe, warm, and uneasy. Then came the knock, not on the door, on the truth. Sheriff Marcus Wade returned just past midnight, his horse lathered and his face pale beneath the dust. Eva, he said, removing his hat slowly. We need to talk. They sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Silas had offered her protection and a name that wasn't a curse. But what Sheriff Wade laid out that night unraveled everything. Your father, the sheriff began, wasn't just a gambler, Eva. He was moving stolen gold. For the Carmichael gang. The words hit her like a bullet to the chest. She blinked, shook her head. That's not possible. He said he had a plan. He was making things right. Wade looked down as if unable to meet the storm in her eyes. His plan got 3 men killed. And the day he died, $30,000 in gold disappeared without a trace. It all clicked together, like the cock of a revolver. The auction. The sudden push to settle her father's debts. The look in Judge Webb's eyes. And now, the Carmichaels. They weren't just coming. They were hunting. They think you know where the gold is, the sheriff said. And word is, Black Pete himself is riding this way. With a dozen men, maybe more. Silas leaned back, arms crossed. Calm, but cold, like a mountain before the avalanche. So they're coming here. Unless we move her, Wade said. Get her out of the territory. But Eva didn't move. Couldn't. Her father's sins weren't just a burden, they were a noose. And now they were wrapped around the one place that had shown her mercy. She looked at Silas, who hadn't spoken in minutes. I should go, she whispered. I won't let them destroy what you've built. Silas finally met her eyes. And in his stare was something deeper than pity. It was resolve. I didn't build this place just for myself. If it only stands while it's easy, then it never meant anything. Wade stood sighing heavily. You've got a day, maybe 2. I'll try to bring men, but you should prepare. And with that, the sheriff disappeared into the darkness. Eva turned back to the window where thunderheads were gathering on the horizon, but it wasn't a storm that was coming. It was reckoning. And in the hours that followed, as they moved through the house, locking windows, loading rifles, counting every breath like it might be their last, Eva and Silas found themselves bound by something more enduring than fear. They worked through the night, the kind of work that makes your fingers blister and your soul ache, nailing boards over windows, filling lanterns, loading bullets into magazines with trembling hands. And still the quiet between them said more than any words could. Silas moved with the grim precision of a man who'd seen war before, not the kind fought in uniforms, but the kind that kicked indoors and took everything from you while you watched helpless. Eva followed, learning fast. She didn't ask where to put the rifles or how to barricade the doors. She just did, because this was her fight now, too. But as dawn crept in pale and bloodless across the horizon, Eva found herself standing in the parlor, staring at the place she'd once thought of as a cage. It didn't feel like that anymore. This was now her home, and it was worth protecting. Silas walked in behind her, wiping sweat from his brow dust, smudging the creases in his face like old war paint. "We'll take shifts," he said. "You sleep first." "I can't," she replied, her voice raw. "Not yet." He nodded. Didn't press. They sat by the fireplace, the silence between them no longer heavy, just familiar. Like a blanket worn thin but warm. "Why'd you do it?" Eva asked suddenly. "Why'd you really buy me?" Silas didn't look at her right away. Instead, he reached into the mantel and pulled down an old, worn photograph, a woman with soft eyes and a ribbon in her hair. "Sarah," he said. "My wife." Eva recognized the name from the night before. The dying promise. The empty upstairs room. "She wanted a daughter," Silas continued. "Always did. Used to think she meant adoption or maybe hiring help. But as she got sick, she got specific. Said, 'There's a girl out there who needs saving. Find her, or I won't rest.'" He chuckled once, a sound that held more pain than humor. "I thought it was grief talking. But when I saw you on that platform, I knew. You weren't being sold. You were being thrown away. And I couldn't let that happen." Eva's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to carry the weight of someone else's dying wish. "But I'm not your daughter," she whispered. "No," Silas said gently. "You're something else. Someone who survived. Someone who still matters." They sat in silence after that until the first rays of sun broke through the eastern sky, golden light spilling across the ranch like a blessing. And somewhere in that morning stillness, something shifted. This wasn't just about debts anymore, or gold, or vengeance. This was about belonging. And as they stood together preparing for whatever came next, they weren't just two broken people holding on to what little they had. They were something stronger, a fortress, a heartbeat. But even as the first light touched the earth, shadows were already moving through the trees. Riders, dust, guns. The sun had barely cleared the ridge when they heard the horses. 6 riders. Not the thundering chaos of a gang raid. No, this was slower, measured. Like men arriving with the certainty that no one would challenge their right to be feared. And at their center, wearing a U.S. Deputy Marshal badge that had never once protected a soul who couldn't pay for it, rode Garrett Boone. Silas stepped onto the porch. As the riders pulled into the yard, his rifle still cradled but not raised. Eva stood just inside the door, heart hammering in her chest like a war drum. She recognized 2 of the men, Jake Morrison from the saloon and Will Dorsey, a rancher who'd lost everything, but still showed up at every auction with liquor on his breath and hatred in his eyes. These men weren't here to enforce the law. They were here to enforce their version of it. Boone dismounted slowly, his spurs catching the morning light. He removed his hat like a gentleman about to deliver a sermon. "Morning, Thornfield. Got some concerns about that girl you picked up at auction." Silas didn't flinch. "You mean Eva Morrison, my legal ward? Purchased fair and square in front of Judge Webb and the entire town." Boone grinned, all teeth and no kindness. "You call that legal in your age, buying a 19-year-old girl off a platform? Folks are talking. Makes a man wonder what kind of arrangement you're running out here." Eva's stomach clenched. There it was. The assumption she feared most, that no matter how safe she felt in Silas's home, the world outside would always paint it as something darker. "If you're here for her," Silas said, stepping off the porch, "you'll need a warrant." Boone's eyes narrowed. "You challenging a federal marshal, Thornfield? I'm challenging a coward in a badge who thinks his title means he can steal what don't belong to him." Tension snapped through the air like a cracked whip. Hands hovered near holsters. No one breathed. Then Eva stepped forward. "I'm not property," she said, her voice clear as morning frost. "And I'm not being held here. Mr. Thornfield gave me a locked room, not a locked door. I chose to stay." Jake Morrison spit tobacco at the ground. "Girl don't know what she's saying. Probably been groomed." Eva's eyes flared. Silas didn't move, not yet. He was waiting, watching Boone, watching to see if the man still had any scrap of decency left. "You can go back to town," Silas said, calm and final. or you can cross this line and make yourself a threat. Boone hesitated. And in that hesitation, something deeper cracked, not just between men, but between stories. Because this wasn't the Old West they wanted it to be. This wasn't about ownership or law or rumors. This was about power. And Eva Morrison had finally stepped into hers. Boone scoffed, swung back into his saddle, and rode off with the others, kicking up dust and bile in their wake. But Eva knew they'd be back. And next time it might not be with badges. Because even as Boone disappeared down the road, a darker shadow loomed behind him. One without law, without mercy, and with a bounty on Eva's head. The silence after Boone left wasn't peace. It was pressure, like the whole house had taken a breath and was holding it, waiting for the storm to return. Silas sat at the kitchen table, elbows on the wood, the weight of what just happened sinking into his bones. Eva stood by the hearth, twisting the hem of her sleeve, torn between guilt and something she couldn't name yet. Something heavy and bright, like defiance. She hadn't run. She hadn't hidden. But what came next would demand more than courage. Sheriff Wade arrived just before dusk. He wasn't alone. 2 deputies flanked him, but it was the wear on his face that told Eva something was wrong before he even opened his mouth. "You best sit down," he said, removing his hat. Silas nodded slowly. "I'm guessing this ain't a courtesy call." "No." "It's about your father," Wade said, looking at Eva. She froze. "We just got word from a telegraph out of Dead Horse Gulch. There's movement. Someone's stirring up the old Carmichael gang." Eva's throat went dry. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Carmichael's men weren't criminals. They were devils in dusters. Train robbers, bank burners, murderers who left nothing but smoke and silence behind them. "They think your father made off with gold," Wade continued. "Stolen from a federal shipment 3 months ago. He was the go-between, only now the gold's gone and they're convinced he left it with someone." Eva's knees buckled. She gripped the fireplace mantel to stay standing. "But I don't know anything," she whispered. He never said a word. Wade glanced at Silas, then back to her. "They don't care. They think you do." Silas stood calm but coiled like a mountain lion. "How long do we have?" 3 days, maybe less." "And Thornfield?" Wade paused, eyes heavy with unspoken warning. "You're sitting on a powder keg. These boys aren't like Boone and his badge polishers. These boys will cut through this ranch like a knife through birthday cake if they think there's gold inside." Silas nodded once, slow and certain. "Then we dig." That night, Eva couldn't sleep. She wandered the hallway, her candle throwing shadows against the walls. Memories of her father flooded her, his laughter when he'd had too much bourbon, the way he promised the future would be better, even as he lost their last acre in a poker game. He was a gambler, but he was also a planner. And there in the floorboard beneath the hearth, the one that creaked different just slightly, she felt the hollow space. With trembling fingers, she pried it open, and there it was. A leather pouch, wrapped in oilskin. Heavy. Gold. Eva stared at it, stunned, not just by the reality of it, but by the betrayal. Her father hadn't told her because he'd never intended for her to carry it. But somehow, it had ended up in her hands anyway. A curse disguised as wealth. "Silas," she whispered, candle shaking in her grip. "You need to see this." When he opened it, he didn't say a word. Just nodded slowly, like a man seeing a storm forming on the edge of the horizon. "So it's true," he said. "Your father did have the gold. And now they'll come for us." Silas closed the pouch, gently stood, and turned toward the window. "Let them. Because sometimes the fight doesn't find you. Until it smells gold." And what came next wasn't just survival. It was war. They came at dawn, not the way lawmen rode in with spurs clinking and intentions announced. No, Carmichael's men rode like shadows on horseback. Silent, deadly. A dust storm of vengeance and greed, sweeping down toward the Thornfield ranch. Eva stood at the upstairs window, heart pounding like a war drum. Below her, Silas moved with precision, every step, calm, every motion measured. He checked the rifles again, bolted the doors, stacked furniture to reinforce the lower windows. The man wasn't building a barricade. He was building a last stand. Out front, the early morning light caught on leather and steel as Black Pete Carmichael dismounted. He was smaller than legend made him out to be. No scars, no eye patch, no monstrous growl. Just cold, sunburnt eyes and a voice smoother than snake oil. "Silas Thornfield," he called out. "I've come for what's mine." Silas stepped out onto the porch rifle, cradled in his arms. His silhouette framed against the golden light like an old oak refusing to fall. "You're trespassing," Silas replied. "You got 30 seconds to ride out before things turn permanent." Pete smiled a cruel, lazy grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You've got something I want, and you've got someone who owes me answers." Behind him, a dozen riders waited. Guns ready, eyes dead. Ava watched from above, clutching the gold pouch to her chest. Not because she wanted to protect the gold, but because she knew it would destroy them if it fell into the wrong hands. "He won't give it to you," she whispered, as if saying it out loud would somehow make it truer. Silas didn't back down, didn't flinch, even when Pete gave the signal. The first gunshot cracked like thunder over the valley. Windows shattered, dust erupted. Silas dropped to one knee and fired back, his rifle bucking like a bronco in his grip. The porch rail splintered. Bullets screamed past his head. Upstairs, Eva threw herself flat, shielding the gold with her body. But she didn't hide. She crawled to the edge of the stairwell, grabbed one of the spare rifles, and breathed like Sarah Thornfield had told her in a prayer written in Silas's eyes. "Don't run. Stand where you're needed." She aimed, missed, fired again, and this time one of Carmichael's men fell. Outside, Pete snarled. His game had changed. The girl wasn't a pawn anymore. She was fighting. Inside, Silas ducked behind the hearth. Blood seeped from a graze on his arm, but his hands were steady. His aim deadly. Every shot was a message. "This is my home. You'll take it only over my dead body." The firefight raged for over an hour. Then the sound of galloping hooves in the distance. Sheriff Wade. Dozens of riders behind him, ranchers, deputies, neighbors. Men who'd worked beside Silas. Who respected him. Who owed him. They came not for law, but for loyalty. Caught between the fire from the house and the oncoming reinforcements, the Carmichael gang buckled. Some surrendered. Some ran. Black Pete didn't. He charged the porch with fury in his heart and a knife in his hand. But Silas met him at the steps, rifle gone, fists raised. And in the dust and blood and rage, it was a man's will, not steel, that settled it. Pete fell. And it was over. The sun rose higher, casting golden light across a battlefield of broken boards and spilled hate. But Thornfield Ranch still stood. And for Eva Morrison now, Eva Thornfield, that sunrise didn't mark the end of the fight. It marked the beginning of a home she chose and a name she reclaimed.